Thank you, Sarah, Patrick, and Larry. Thank you, Mayor Glass, and City Council members. So, hold the mic. Oh, hold the mic. Okay. Hold them.
Oh, you gotta go underneath the table. Underneath the table.
No, unwrap the wires. There you go.
Okay, better? Okay. So this is a presentation of the actual work that we did over the last year. And the main focus of the work was to answer the question, is there a financially feasible project on this site? And so I'm going to take you through step by step the work that we did. Sorry. So the city team that worked on this was the subcommittee, which consisted of Patrick Slater, the vice mayor, Sarah Gurney, city council member, and Larry McLaughlin, city manager, My firm, Linda Herman Consulting, Kaiser Marston Associates, for which Reed Kawahara is here, and David Baker Architects. So the overview of what we're going to see today is we basically worked in two phases, phase 1 and phase 2, and as the subcommittee mentioned, we're asking to go to phase 3. The first phase was to really give some definition to what does Sebastopol need and how we went about that, and then phase 2 was the financial feasibility analysis, and we're going to go through the actual work that we did, and then we'll discuss the next steps that we're proposing. So just to give context, the red outline is the property that the city owns, and the top of the slide is Petaluma Avenue, bottom of the slide is South Main, to the left is Burnett, and to the right is actually the driveway of the mortuary where we would be proposing that Willow Street go through. And here's the actual parcel map of the actual parcels that the city controls. And the somewhat triangular piece is 241 Main Street, and then the other little rectangle is the Chamber of Commerce. So we've been working at this, as Larry mentioned, since last April. We've been working very methodically and consistently all the way through. Up until now, we've had about 16 meetings, and it's just been moving forward since last April. More to say about that. So the approach that we took, we wanted to be very respectful of the city's resources, knowing that they were limited, and wanted to make best use of them, and we wanted to be very, again, methodical and step-by-step about how we went through our work. We initially, the first step was to assess the community needs, and from there establish what the goals of what the city of Sebastopol would want there and needs there. Once we had that established, we did community outreach to the most immediate neighbors, and then assessed whether there be other resources that we needed to proceed with the work. So in assessing community needs, we were aware that there was a lot of previously completed work that had been done. Some referenced already the downtown plan in 1990, Center of the City report that Sarah spoke about in 2010, that basically looked at all the city parcels and said, what could we do here? Then the core project, which is a citizen advocacy group that was formed in 2010, and they sponsored an international competition of how to revitalize the downtown core. And what also grew out of the core project was a grant that they applied for from the American Institute of Architects for $25,000 that brought this sustainable design assessment team to our city. And that team, what they do is go into municipalities to assess how is the best way to be a sustainable community. So they don't just look at housing or parking or anything, they look at the biggest picture possible. And that resulted in what's called the SDAT report, which was completed in 2013. At the same time, we reviewed the general plan, which was in motion at that time and has since been adopted in November 2016. So this gave us a lot of background work completed to date, a lot of information, and very consistent information. So out of that research, we were able to establish project goals for the project, which these have been previously approved by the City Council, I believe, last year. So Pine Grove Square is envisioned as a vibrant infill project which would enhance, enliven, and expand the downtown core, enrich existing businesses, and maximize the city's resources and assets. The potential project would include the following: a lively mix of compatible uses, housing, whether workforce or senior, undetermined at the moment, an extension of the Willow Street to Petaluma Avenue, would maintain adequate parking in the downtown area, would provide for the maximum feasible provision for community space, and a connection to the Joe Rodoto Trail for pedestrians and bicycles. Once we established those goals, we put out an invitation to all the adjacent business owners and property owners to meet with us to review the work that we had done. We had a fairly lively meeting in June of 2016 and received feedback at that time on those goals that we just reviewed. So now that we kind of had this picture of what we might put there and what would serve the community best, that we developed the next scope of work, which to do a financial feasibility analysis, you need what's called massing studies, which we'll review in detail, and the financial analysis. And no one on the subcommittee or my firm is actually skilled in those two areas of work, so we needed to get additional consultants, and we went through a competitive process where we issued requests for proposals for real estate economists and an architect. We conducted interviews, did a comparative cost analysis of the services provided, and at the end of the day, we hired Kaiser Larson Associates, which is a real estate economic firm out of San Francisco. They did the market data research and the analysis, and the performance development and the financial analysis. And David Baker Architects worked with us on our planning assumptions and conducted the massing studies. So the actual work in phase 2, now that we completed the first piece of work, was, as mentioned, the general plan was in motion at the time, so we needed to develop our planning assumptions, the market demand analysis, then the massing studies, and then the ultimate financial feasibility analysis. Since the general plan was in motion, we worked very closely with Kenny Webster, the planning director, to make sure we weren't making any assumptions that were not in line with what the general plan currently is, ordinances are, and what it could be. So from a land use perspective, mixed use in the downtown core is totally appropriate. The open space requirements we assumed were 50 square feet per dwelling, which could be on the ground as park or as a deck or a balcony attached to a unit. The maximum building height assumed is 4 stories or 50 feet. The maximum density allowed is 1 unit per 1,000 square feet of land area. And parking assumed was 1 car per 500 square feet, with commercial parking accommodated on the street. At this point in time, so that gave, the beginnings of context for what might be there. I'm going to turn it over now for Reed to walk us through the market demand analysis, which is, what is there a demand for in Sebastopol?
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Reed Kawahara. I'm a principal with Kaiser Marston Associates in San Francisco. We're a firm that specializes in real estate development economics, and specifically the potential for developing on city properties. We do a number of public-private projects with cities and other public jurisdictions throughout the state. So, as Linda mentioned, the first component of the economic analysis was the market demand analysis. And essentially, what that's doing in simple terms is answering the question, if you build it, will they come? And so what that's doing in a quantitative way, it's analyzing what the market demand is for the potential of developing the site with various uses. What we analyzed in terms of potential uses for the site included residential, it included retail, it included commercial office space, and obviously with those various uses there's parking associated with that, and we considered some public parking options as well, which I'll mention in a minute. Next slide. So I think as been mentioned earlier, one of the key aspects of the market demand study is to analyze what we consider to be the highest and best use of the property. The highest and best use is defined as that use which is legally permitted based on current or anticipated development regulations in the city. That use which is financially feasible, which I will describe later on. And that use which will derive the highest value in terms of dollars for the property. So there are a number of factors that went into our assessment of the highest and best use. First and foremost, I think one thing that everyone in the room will recognize inherently is that there is tremendous need for housing throughout the Bay Area and also in Sebastopol and in this region. That's exacerbated by sort of extreme imbalance between this demand for housing and the lack of supply, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And that's manifested itself in rising rents and home values and so forth. In terms of retail demand, the one thing that is recognized throughout the industry is that the retail industry is evolving. In large part as a result of online commerce, which many of us in the room, I'm sure, take part in. But as a function of that, what you'll find is that a lot of retail centers are changing as time goes on. And what that resulted in it is less demand for physical retail space. So you will find that there's not as much new development of retail space and shopping centers throughout the country. In fact, there are many shopping centers which are suffering as a result. However, for a variety of reasons, which I'll elaborate on further, we do see an opportunity for more retail development on this site, but we see it as being a sort of supportive use rather than primary use. In terms of commercial office space, this is also a use where we've identified a potential demand. However, we don't see that the commercial office element being the highest and best use by itself. Again, we see that as being more of a supportive use or ancillary use to complement the whole project, as well as to complement the balance of the downtown. So I think as been mentioned already, our conclusion overall was that the highest and best use of the site is a mixed-use project with residential above ground floor commercial retail. Okay, so just to focus a little bit further on the residential element of the project, I think a lot of the factors here probably won't come as a surprise to anyone in the room. Sebastopol is a very desirable small town community. A lot of people would desire to live here. But as I mentioned before, there is an extreme imbalance of supply and demand. And of course, as I mentioned before, that's pushing up values and making it very unaffordable for a lot of low-income and, in fact, middle-income workforce households to live here. Another factor affecting residential demand is what we refer to as high barriers to entry. And what that means is that Sebastopol is a largely built-out community. There aren't a lot of opportunities for new development here. And as a result of that, it's difficult to create new supply. And so while the demand continues to rise, it's difficult to build new supply, and that's what we refer to as a high barrier to entry for new residents. Also, as referred to earlier, there are demographic trends that contribute to residential demand, not only in terms of overall growth in the county, but also, as referred to previously, the aging of the population, which points to opportunities for senior housing on this site, and also points to an opportunity for what we refer to as affordability by design. And what we mean by that are design of smaller units, which by definition will be more affordable, which I can discuss more later in the presentation. And finally, in terms of residential demand, there's a growing interest, probably as many know, in living in downtown mixed-use settings, walkable settings where you have restaurants, you have services, you have arts and entertainment opportunities close by. And so there's an increasing trend throughout the Bay Area and throughout the state to develop housing in downtown. So that's yet another factor contributing to the residential demand. So I just have a couple of really quick slides here addressing some of the metrics that we looked at in terms of the quantitative analysis that attach some numbers to some of the things that I think most of us intuitively know about what's happening in the region. What this is showing on the left-hand side is the projection of growth, of household growth in Sonoma County in the coming years. This is a projection done by Association of Bay Area Governments. And what they're showing is a demand for, or what they're showing is a projection of a need for 1,200 new households a year throughout the county. No, let me just finish that. So on the right-hand side, what that's showing is historically what the county has produced in terms of new supply has been about 600 units per year. And so that's what I was referring to before about the imbalance of supply and demand. Okay, next. Another factor that contributes to residential demand is basically the strong economy, which is being exhibited here by the constantly decreasing unemployment rates, which of course with a strong economy generates more demand for housing as well. Okay, so what all that means, as I mentioned before, is that translates into housing affordability challenges. The chart on the left-hand side shows how rents have been rising since the recession, quite significantly, as you can see, in the county. Sebastopol itself has a similar trend, but county-wide, it is estimated that in 2016, the average rent was closing in on $2,000 a unit a month, which is obviously quite a significant increase over the last several years. On the right-hand side of this slide is demonstrates the increase in median home values or home prices in Sebastopol. Okay, so just to say a few more words about the factors that contribute to retail demand. In terms of retail, what we're really anticipating is that retail in this project will be able to build on many of the strengths that already exist in downtown Sebastopol. Sebastopol's downtown is very well established. It's a regional destination. It's very walkable. And as I said before, a lot of people are interested in more of the commercial retail restaurant options that are already afforded by downtown Sebastopol. And actually, one of the things that downtowns in general and Sebastopol in particular benefit from is I was referring to previously to the evolution of the retail industry. Well, one of the actual strengths of the retail industry is what we refer to as experience retail. And what we mean by that is retail that's combined with restaurants, it's combined with entertainment options like movie theaters, museums, performing arts centers, as well as recreational opportunities like parks and trails and historic resources. And these are all attributes that exist in downtown Sebastopol already. So from a retail perspective, the space within this project will benefit from all the advantages that already exist in downtown Sebastopol. A couple of other factors that contribute to that are the desire by a lot of retail tenants to locate where there's critical mass of other retail and
around what could be built. And I want to preface this with, this is not design. We're going to be looking at blocks of volume of space. These are just site plans right now, but I just want to say we're not building anything orange, we're not building anything blue. This is like pre-conceptual work, and it just gives the data for like what could fit. So scheme 1 to the left is where we basically leave the city-controlled property as is, but we incorporate the Chamber of Commerce site. And that land area is about 1.18 acres, and per the density requirement of 1 unit per 1,000 square feet of land, that scheme would yield about 51 units. Scheme 2, we looked at saying, well, what would happen if we, the term is normalize the site, give it a shape that might be more attractive to a developer, provide more opportunity for more built space. It would definitely take the willingness of those property owners to work with us and negotiate with us, but it would, again, provide a more attractive site. That land area is approximately 1.6 acres, and the density that it would yield is 69 units on this site. So scheme 1, where we keep the site as is, but incorporate the chamber. So pink just represents what would be the ground floor commercial space. The bluish gray just represents residential. It will not be a blue and pink building. I promise, we promise. It's just to assess volume, because we need those numbers. So as we said, the pink represents commercial space on the ground floor, residential above. The parking is represented where it says parking. That would provide the parking that the project would demand, and the green represents open space. In this scenario, the 51 units would be comprised of 8 studios, 35 one-bedrooms, and 8 two-bedrooms. And here we're looking at plans, so we're looking down on it. On the left is the ground level, again, pink represented by the commercial space, bluish represented there. You can see with that we were able to get more residential space on what would be potentially the Willow Street pass-through. Green represents the open space. And in this picture on the right, that is sitting on top of, there's the second and third levels are sitting on top of the ground level. And again, the residential is above, and green below. All the open space is a combination of ground level and, as we said, balconies and decks. In scheme 2, where we have incorporated other properties, we actually get 69 units. In this scenario, we just said, okay, we'll do 10 studios, 49 one-bedrooms, and 10 two-bedrooms. Again, much more frontage of commercial space along South Main, represented by the pink. And you can see green space and the parking, that again, the parking on site and on the street accommodates the project. Here again, we have those same plan views on the left at the ground level. You can see there'd be more green open space, residential along Willow, commercial along South Main, and wrapping the corner onto Burnett, with residential fully above it on the second and third stories. So here's a side-by-side comparison of the two schemes. The site as is, which does incorporate the Chamber of Commerce in both, is about 1.18 acres versus 1.58 acres. Both scenarios, again, these are just scenarios, for 3 stories high. Total number of units in scheme 1 is 51, and of those 51, we would get 10 units that would be in the inclusionary housing requirement. In scheme 2, we get a total of 69 units, and 14 of those would be the low-income units. As mentioned before, we talked about affordability by design. You can see that the average unit size is relatively small, 632 square feet in scheme 1 and 674 square feet in scheme 2, which is also a trend kind of all across in building industry now, is making much, much smaller units. The retail area we would, in this scheme, would yield 7,500 square feet of retail space at the ground level, and in scheme 2, 12,550 square feet, significantly more. The parking spaces required by scheme 1, which also includes parking on the street, are 75 spaces, and in scheme 2, 107 would be required. And open space at ground level, as well as balconies and decks, equals about 6,100 square feet in scheme 1 and 7,500 square feet in scheme 2. And I just again want to close with, should this become a project, there will be the creative design process later on with plenty of opportunity for community involvement. This is just how much square feet can fit here. So we can go to the next step, which is the financial feasibility analysis.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, the second element of the economic analysis that we did was the financial feasibility analysis. And essentially what that's doing is it is modeling the development economics of the two schemes that we just discussed to estimate what it would cost to build the project, what the project would support in terms of rents and an investment by a private developer, and whether there is sufficient profit margin in the project to support the project, and in fact to support a land payment to the city and to the private property owners if they are involved, and whether that supported land value represents a fair market value for the development opportunity. So what I'm going to present here is just this one slide, which is a very high-level summary of the feasibility analysis. Really quickly, I just wanted to say that our full report that includes all the figures and analysis behind this summary was included in the council packet, so anybody interested in getting into the details certainly can make that available that way. Another important reminder has been discussed previously is that the assumption here is that the city would be partnering with a private developer to build the project, and not that the city would be in the business of developing the site itself. Therefore, the economics that you see here represent the economics to a private developer to build the project. And I think the last thing I want to clarify is, in terms of the residential use, we are assuming at the moment that they will be rental apartments for a variety of reasons, which I can get into further detail if necessary. But we think that it's most likely that the project will be developed as rental. That's not to say that it would be precluded to be for sale or from being for sale condominiums, but our assumption is apartments, though. But that set that as an assumption. So anyway, summarizing the feasibility analysis here under the two schemes. Again, as Linda mentioned, 51 units versus 69 units, 7,500 square feet of commercial space versus 12,000 roughly. So below the horizontal line, what you see is our estimate of projected operating income. The operating income is comprised of primarily rental income off of the apartments, combined with rental income from the ground floor commercial spaces. Also taking into account annual operating expenses for property taxes and repairs and maintenance and security and so on and so forth. So what we estimate for the operating income, net operating income, is between $757,000 to $1.1 million roughly per year. Now, you take that estimate of projected income to translate that into what we refer to as supported private investment. So what a private developer would do is estimate the income and then what they could afford to invest in the project based on their capital return requirements. And so what we estimate from the income projection is that under Scheme 1, this supported private investment is roughly $12.8 million to roughly $18.7 million in Scheme 2. So essentially, from a sort of simple approach, I mean, the approach is not particularly, all the analysis is not particularly simple, but I'm presenting it in a somewhat simple way here, which is to say, how do we arrive at what we estimate the land value to be? Well, you subtract the estimated development costs without a land cost in it from the supported private investment. You'll arrive at what we estimate the value of the site to be. And so doing that math, you can see that for Scheme 1, we estimate the land value at about $990,000 in total, to, in Scheme 2, $1.3 million. And of course, you would expect that outcome because Scheme 2 is bigger than Scheme 1, so you would expect that to have a higher value. And again, as we mentioned before, because Scheme 2 includes the participation, if they choose to do so, of some other private property owners on the site, the land value there, the 1.3 million, would be shared not only by the city, which owns most of the site, but by the private property owners as well. So then what we did finally is we compared these values with land sales of other properties in Sebastopol to conclude whether these values are consistent with other properties, to conclude whether a fair market value for the site is supported. And our assessment and research of those land sales indicate that these are within the range of what properties have been selling for. And so our conclusion is that this is in fact a feasible project and potentially worth moving on to the next stage of the analysis. So I'll pass it back to Linda to sort of wrap up next steps.
So in light of the fact that the answer to the question, is there a financially feasible project here, is yes, we're recommending to the City Council that we move forward with Phase 3, which would include some informal outreach to the development community to see what the interest is out there, more continued community outreach to hear from the community their concerns, what they want to contribute to the idea of the project, and contributing to solutions for some of those concerns, and to start a conversation with the other property owners to assemble the other parcels that we've talked about. Should we get through Phase 3 and it's still yes, let's move forward, we would advance to Phase 4, which would be putting out what's called the request for qualification and proposal to a developer, and then should we find one that we're happy with and want to engage with, we would move on to preparing what's called the disposition and development agreement. But we're not asking about Phase 4 now, we just want to ask approval to move on to Phase 3, because to this point, all signs are positive that there is something really good to be done on the site. So in conclusion, we're just asking, we just want to come back to the City Council action, which is that we want to provide opportunity tonight for community comment, to confirm the council's policy goals, and to provide direction on proceeding with funding for Phase 3. And that concludes our presentation. Any questions?